A few weeks ago, AOC was asked about her position on nuclear energy, and she said, quote, "I don't take a strong anti or pro position on it." And she, quote, "leaves the door open on nuclear so that we can have that conversation." To me, it came across as if she was indifferent on this issue. I take a stronger position against transitioning us to nuclear energy for several reasons that I'm going to get into in this segment. I do acknowledge that this has been a contentious issue among people on the left, and it requires a lot of nuance, so hopefully I can make my position clear by the end of this. The argument that a lot of people make is that if we're going to transition off of fossil fuels to 100% renewable clean energy, there's going to have to be a transition to nuclear energy first for some period of time. I get how this plan can be convincing in theory, but the reality of nuclear energy and the real world that we're living in right now makes transitioning to nuclear energy irresponsible and unnecessary. The first argument I want to make is just purely logistical. Climate scientists say we have about 10 to 12 year window to get to zero carbon emissions. Like I said earlier, people have suggested that since we don't currently have the infrastructure and technology to power the country 100% off of green renewable energy, we're going to have to make the transition to nuclear energy while we build the necessary infrastructure. But it's not like we have the nuclear energy infrastructure to power the country 100% off of it right now. It takes 6 to 12 years to build a nuclear power plant. I believe only 20% of the energy used in the United States comes from nuclear power plants. So the time that we'd spend building up nuclear power plants would basically be all the time we have to get to zero carbon emissions. But the entire time we're building the power plants, we'd still be emitting insane amounts of carbon into the air, so it'd be too late anyway by the time the 10 to 12 year window closes. We would spend all that time and money and resources building two separate infrastructures, and one of them, the nuclear energy infrastructure, is going to have to go through a whole other process to decommission and to close those power plants. To me, that just seems like we're unnecessarily diverting money and resources that can go into building the clean, green infrastructure and technology that is going to run the country in the future. I don't know how great of an analogy this is, but for me, it comes across like this. Imagine you're in med school and you want to be a surgeon. So after you graduate from med school, you'll do your residency for, I forget how many years it is, 4 years, 5 years, and then you're a surgeon. Now imagine the whole time you're in med school, you decide that you're going to take classes at another college in business administration just in case this whole doctor thing doesn't work out. You are unnecessarily dividing your resources and focus working on the main goal and the backup plan at the same time. Wouldn't it make more sense to focus all of your energy and resources on the main goal? And in the case of nuclear energy, it's even worse because instead of just having a useless, unnecessary degree, you'd be creating a whole other set of problems that you'd have to deal with at some point in the future. Nuclear energy and the toxic waste that it produces are pretty dangerous. The purpose of getting off of fossil fuels is they pose a threat to all life on the planet. Nuclear waste and fallout can kill millions of people and destroy the environment if it gets into the air and the water. We don't know how to properly handle or dispose of nuclear waste. The radioactive material will remain toxic in some cases for hundreds of thousands of years. And the best we can do with it right now is to just bury it in the ground. So why on earth would anyone think it's a good idea to use even more nuclear energy to replace the dangerous fossil fuels that we're on right now? Imagine a 5-year-old juggling loaded guns with the safety off, and your response is, you know what? Let me go find him some sharp kitchen knives to juggle until I find him a safe rubber ball to play with. We will be trading one looming threat to humanity and life on this planet for another one. The feeling I get from a lot of people who make the argument that we need to transition to nuclear energy is the arrogance of humanity that usually comes about from some weird instinct to trust authority figures, and also when things have been relatively stable in recent years. People really are going around acting like, oh no, trust me, we got all this nuclear energy thing figured out. It's going to be great. There's no reason to worry. We have all the smart scientists and all these government agencies. They know what they're doing. It wasn't that long ago when the US government was willy-nilly doing nuclear tests all over the place without realizing the effects that they were having on the environment and then the people in the surrounding areas. In the 40s and the 50s, the US government was testing nuclear weapons on the Marshall Islands. The people who lived in the area were told that they had to leave their houses for 3 months before it was safe to come back to their homes. Turns out, 60 years later, all the Marshall Islands are still heavily contaminated, and there are some places where it's impossible to live, still 60 years later. And we sent those people back to their homes to get sick and die from the radioactive waste that was embedded in their environment. In one of the experiments that they were doing at the time, they miscalculated how large the explosion would be, and it was more than 2 times what they expected, and the fallout reached parts of the island where people were still living. People were outside. Children were outside playing in nuclear fallout because they thought it was snow. Kids were putting it in their mouth. And the attempt to clean up the island was just as inadequate as the preparation before. The US military gathered up everything that had been in contact with nuclear fallout and basically just threw it in a pit where they detonated the bombs and then cemented over the whole thing. 9 people died during the cleanup because of the toxic radiation. Now, just yesterday, I believe there's stories coming out about the tomb, as they call it, is beginning to crack. And sea level rise or a strong hurricane can release all of that radioactive material into the atmosphere and out into the world. And here's the kicker. When the tomb was first being built, the US government was saying, oh no, this isn't going to be a permanent thing. This is just a temporary fix until we come up with a proper way to dispose of the nuclear waste. Well, time went by and shit happens, and what was sold to people as a temporary fix became an inadequate permanent fix that is failing and causing problems decades later here in 2019. I just wish people would realize humans are intelligent, but when that intelligence turns to hubris and arrogance, it's a recipe for disaster. There are limitations to what we know, especially when it comes to nuclear energy. And there are limitations to things that we should do with it because we don't know as much as we should. It is arrogant to think that in just a few decades, we have all the answers when it comes to nuclear energies. When it wasn't that long ago, we were just out detonating nuclear bombs in the atmosphere because we didn't realize what the fallout would do to the environment and the people around it. Has technology and scientific understanding advanced? Yes, of course it has. But 50 years from now, when we learn even more about nuclear energy and technology, who's to say we won't look back and say, holy shit, what they were doing back in 2019 with nuclear energy, they were reckless. They put people's lives in danger. I'm sure when people built the nuclear power plants back in the 50s and the 60s, they thought that they had it on lock, and they thought that they had nuclear technology all figured out. And then look what happened a couple decades later. We had a huge meltdown at Chernobyl and at Fukushima and other places around the world that could have been way worse and killed millions of people if they had fully melted down and exploded. Fukushima is still leaking insane amounts of radioactive waste into the Pacific Ocean that is still spreading around the world to this day after the site was shut down in 2011. And it bugs me that we're going to blindly trust our government that has only become more corrupt and irresponsible since the initial nuclear weapons test at places like Marshall Island to create more nuclear waste across the entire country. The reality show host and circus clown buffoon Donald Trump is the president of the United States right now. Right at this second. The secretary for the energy department is the notorious dumbass dunce boy Rick Perry, who couldn't even remember the name of the energy department while he was running for president and saying one of his top policy priorities is to eliminate the Department of Energy. Those are the two people who would have final say on all decisions regarding any type of nuclear energy in this country. Final say on the standards we use, final say on hiring decisions, and the people who would run these programs and do the research. Are you really willing to put the lives of millions of Americans at risk by allowing these two idiots to transition the country into nuclear energy? And beyond them just being insanely stupid, they are also in the insanely corrupt Republican Party that for decades has proven they don't give a shit about protecting the environment or enforcing environmental regulations. Rick Perry to this day is an avid climate change denier. He was on the board of Energy Transfer Partners right before he became the secretary for the Department of Energy. He was on the board of the company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline right through the main source of water for over 2 million Americans, despite the fact that that pipeline will inevitably burst and contaminating the drinking water. Our government actively covers up cases of contaminated drinking water across the country already. And mind you, those situations are fairly easy to remedy and a lot less complicated than, let's say, if you have nuclear contamination. 5 years later, Flint, Michigan still has contaminated water coming out of their pipes. This situation could be so easily remedied. What it requires is switching the water source back to the original water source and replacing all of those corroded pipes that are flowing throughout the area and in people's homes. It will cost maybe $100 million to fix, and it still hasn't been done. Our federal government and the state government in Michigan continue to ignore this crisis and can't get their shit together to replace the pipes in Flint, Michigan. This situation would get even more complicated if instead of lead flowing through the pipes in Flint, Michigan, it was nuclear waste. Reuters did an investigation and found that there are almost 4,000 cities across the country that have double the amounts of lead contamination than Flint. And people are still going to tell me they trust the federal government to bury even more nuclear waste by people's drinking water in a safe way. In 2017, there was a story about how in Miami there was a nuclear power plant that's was looking to build a new site to store their toxic waste, and they got approval to build it underneath the main source of water from Miami, water that is supplied to almost 3 million people. And when the federal government, specifically Rick Perry's Department of Energy, was asked, hey, don't you think that's a little dangerous? They responded by saying it's not likely. It's not likely that the nuclear waste would leak into the water and contaminate the drinking water for almost 3 million people. It's not likely. Like I said earlier, in theory, maybe if we lived in a perfect world, that would sound like a good idea to transition to nuclear energy, where we could trust our government to always look out for our best interests and never to lie to us or never cover up stories of water contamination. Maybe then it might sound like a slightly better idea. But even if that was the case, and it isn't the case, there are limitations to what we know about nuclear energy and the effects of it. And like I've been spending this most of the segment talking about, we don't live in that perfect world where our government is looking out for our best interest and protecting the environment and protecting its citizens. We live in a world where the corrupt Republican Party and Donald Trump, the first thing Donald Trump did when he came into office, one of the first things he did was to undo a rule from the Obama administration that would have blocked coal companies from dumping their toxic ash into the waterways. That was one of the first things Donald Trump did when he came into office, because the Republican Party is so corrupt and so bought off by industry. They are willing to put people's lives at risk so that their donors can make even more profit. And you're going to trust that same goddamn government to store nuclear waste across the entire country? You're out of your fucking mind if you think that. And like I said earlier, we don't have the time and resources to waste building up nuclear energy infrastructure when we could focus all that time and money and resources and energy into getting us to clean, green technology that would power the country in the future. We knew about how dangerous the climate change threat would be for decades. And now, to this day, we haven't done a goddamn thing about it. And the window of opportunity we have to address it is close to closing. Our back is up against the wall. And you're going to tell me, in order to barely skate by out of that catastrophe, we're going to move on to something that's equally as dangerous, if not more dangerous. Who's to say we're going to have time to address a nuclear energy catastrophe if it were to take place? Who's to say we'd have the technology or the resources or the know-how to do that? We haven't even gotten out of the first catastrophe, and you're willing to put us back into another one just for a transition. How about we just skip the bullshit? We skip the incrementalism and we go straight to the green technology.